I want to just start by speaking about my frames of reference, and you covered a number of them, Franco, but I think it's relevant for my comments today to hear the rest of it. So I did start my life as a diabetes researcher with engineering and physiology degrees. I did basic science for many years, but over the years, and I'm old now, I've done work, I like to say scholarly work or written papers in clinical, population and public health, and health services and policy research. And as Franco said, my current academic work and my current focus is on systems thinking. But I also worked as a funder for many years. I was part of the inaugural cohort of scientific directors for our Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which was 20 years ago, new incarnation of our federal government's health research funding organization. And then subsequent to that, served as the president and CEO of a provincial level health research funder. So I get the psyche of funders a lot, and I'm going to make some comments about the funding scheme itself. But as I said, systems thinking is it, practitioner, and I've been practicing probably for 15 years, and it came out of the work I did as a national funder and my focus in that institute on obesity, to somebody who also sits on a number of boards now for large projects and scientific advisories. And I teach systems thinking, and I'm getting ready to teach a cohort of students in January in a full-time intensive course. And I also collaborated with the UK Academy of Medical Sciences as co-chair of a recent report on systems thinking as it applies to public health, and where we need to go to really bring more systems thinking into the kind of work that you folks do. As I said, member of a bunch of advisories, including some related projects like Co-Create here. And so I have a sense of that. But I do have a limited knowledge of the projects that are you're focusing on today, although I was pleased to sit and listen to the report back from the breakouts to get a sense of where you're at with respect to stakeholder engagement. So I understood your objective of the 2 days was to develop recommendations for a sustainable plan for future policy action and stakeholder engagement around childhood obesity. So I've worked in many of these areas. On the sustainability plan, my comments are going to come out that essentially the programs are not set up to create sustainability. We're Canada, we always talk about being a country of pilot projects, and I think that's true in lots of places. But you'll see, I think maybe you can build sustainability, but as many people recognized in the last session, that's based on stakeholder engagement and trust and working well together. I was asked to speak about knowledge transfer or knowledge translation at this conference and bring thoughts there. So I thought, well, let's bring you a definition first. It's defined as a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, et cetera, around, and in this case, this is one about health because it comes from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And in the last plenary, when you were reporting back from the breakouts, it was interesting to hear comments about governance. And so one thing I would say is that yes, governance and government can make a difference. So when CIHR, which is the federal government funding agency, was set up 20 years ago, it was a funding agency that had to change its stripes from what it was before, because the legislation, federal legislation that created the agency, spoke about both knowledge creation and knowledge transfer. And so it gave impetus to the organization to invest in knowledge transfer. They came up with a definition, and 15 years ago, they really became a leader in the KT domain. The vice president for knowledge translation at CIHR in those years was a fellow named Ian Graham, which is, he's a leader, and all the authors on the paper that produced this framework for integrated knowledge translation came from the organization. So clearly, legislation, organizational focus can lead to change. I bring you this framework because while it helps really understand all the different pieces pieces of knowledge translation, of getting those findings into action to really making a difference. There's lots of different pieces there. But I don't necessarily like the image, because the image conveys that you can break this down into its pieces and begin to manage and make change for knowledge translation using all these different areas. And so it may be helpful. As a research framework, it helps you understand the different pieces. But really, in the real world, knowledge translation looks more like this. It's much messier. You all recognize that in the conversations you were just having. There's all different kinds of motivations and incentives for knowledge translation. And it really does start at that building relationship piece. So I want us to go forward in our conversation today, recognizing knowledge translation is complex, not just complicated. And shortly, I'll make the distinction about the difference between complex and complicated. Just one last slide to reiterate the notion that KT is complex. There's more than 100 different ways to say knowledge translation. You probably can't read this. You can't even access the site anymore, but it's just to remind us that many different disciplines use different language which overlaps, but may or may not be exactly the same. In addition to KT being complex, obesity is complex, not just complicated. And hopefully, most of you have seen this obesity system map produced by the UK Government Office for Science back in, I don't know, what was it, like in the 2000s, late 2000s, something like that. But it was the picture that drove me into trying to understand, okay, so if this is what it looks like, and I don't really care about the details, what does that mean for how we make change? And so that sent me on the journey of trying to understand how to, if you will, make things work when the world is complex, not just complicated. So my first two key messages are that knowledge transfer is complex and not just complicated, and global childhood obesity is complex, not just complicated. So what does that mean? Well, that means that problems that are complex tend to be unpredictable, self-organizing, and emergent. And that's kind of in contrast to the idea that you can predict what's going to happen or work out all the causes of the problem and then control the problem, like childhood obesity, or that you could design interventions that will work in this place and then can be transferred into this place. It has you focused, like the difference between complex and complicated is significant, and it means that we need to start thinking differently about the solutions. And so I'm here to try to help you think a little bit differently about some of the solutions. Another framework for thinking about the difference between simple, complicated, and complex is this Stacy matrix. And in this matrix, the x-axis is if you have lots of certainty about a problem, and on the y-axis you have a lot of agreement about what to do, then the problem can be classified as simple. But as our certainty about what to do shifts, and in complexity, you have less certainty because of all the different variables that are in play, and you're likely to have less agreement, then you're moving from simple to complicated to complex. And when there's virtually no agreement and no certainty, you can be in a chaotic state. And it's easy to imagine different scenarios here. I often think about the COVID pandemic, that at some level we were certain that we're pretty certain that wearing masks is important, but there isn't necessarily a lot of agreement about whether we should do that, etc. You can come up with lots of examples. And when you're in the zone where there's lots of agreement, but not a lot of certainty, as there was early in the pandemic for many, then you are making a judgment because you may not have all the evidence. But if you're in the zone where there's actually lots of certainty and less agreement, then you have a political problem. So understanding that distinction between judgmental and political decision-making can also be helpful. And the solutions are different. So when a problem is simple, you can have a best practice. And we often hear the language of best practice in this area as it relates to exercise, any of those sorts of things. You can have standards and you can be rational about a problem. But when a problem is complicated, you can't actually have a best practice. You can have a promising practice. You still think the problem is knowable, but you need really detailed approaches to get there. But when a problem is complex, it's not necessarily knowable. Your practice is no longer best practice or emergent or promising practice. It becomes emergent practice. It's in real time. And you need a more innovative approach with dialogue and debate and trial and error. And we don't actually set up the funding schemes, as I'm going to say later, to really be comfortable with that idea of trial and error. But this is actually what we need for both the complexity of KT and the complexity of global obesity. So, actually we've known about and understood how to deal with complex problems for a long time. And I'm just bringing you a couple of oldie comments from some old papers. This one from 1973, Riddle and Weber. And it's a great piece if you're interested in thinking about some of these things. And the point is that wicked or complex problems require different mental models. So I haven't heard people talk about mental models yet, and they're different from tame problems. So one of the things is there's no actual definitive formulation of a wicked problem. And our usual reductionist approach to understanding these problems suggests that you need to work out all the causes of the problem, but there's no definitive formulation here. And solutions or approaches are not true or false, or they're sort of good or bad. They either move us in the right direction or they move us in the wrong direction. And we're never done with a complex problem. And then the last one, and I think this is important, and I heard lots of comments about the idea of building a common understanding in the last session, is that you need to understand that problem understanding and problem resolution go hand in hand. So if the first thing you do when you're trying to build a relationship with stakeholders is to build a common understanding of the problem, you will already begin to formulate the solutions that work across the sectors that are there trying to build that common understanding. Another early systems thinker is Checkland, and in this paper, he talks about hard system thinking. That's kind of complicated thinking versus soft system thinking, which is really, in his case, he was proposing it for the 80s and 90s, but we're not there yet. There's differences in things like goal orientation versus learning orientation, and we'll come back to that. Again, similar to the other, it assumes that you can engineer a system as opposed to think about it and explore different models of it. There's many advantages if you have a complicated problem to thinking about it in ways that help you understand complicated problems. But that doesn't really help you very much when it comes to complex problems. How many years have we been arguing about the causes of climate change when we should have been talking about the solutions and approaches to changing practices and building a better and just future? So different mindset. And we need to not only shift the mindset of the people who, like you, who are working in the systems, but also of the funders. Okay, so my next key message is that complex problems are different from complicated problems, and we really need different mental models and approaches to really address them. Okay, so I did pull from the websites a little look at the projects that you're talking about today. I'm not going to spend time here, but I highlighted some language that made me think, okay, well, we're not there yet when it comes to the mindset that we need to deal with the complexity of the problems. So scientifically sound, policy relevant, and root causes. I'm already pushing the idea that root causes and policy relevant may not go hand in hand, even though we would like them to. Even identifying critical stages and the most effective and efficient, that's language that comes from systems that are top down and make it happen kinds of systems. Adapt, replicate, and implement effective health interventions. Here's where, okay, the language isn't necessarily counter to what you need to do, but the idea of best practices, I've already suggested, needs to be rethought, and understand what are the best, maybe the best processes that get us to build trust in the relationships that we need. just, the work that you guys are doing is based on a pyramid that looks something like this, the evidence-based medicine pyramid, which puts things like, expert opinion at the bottom. And yet when you have a complex problem, the experts on a local scale are the expert opinion is actually a really important part of the evidence base that you need. And here, when we get all the way up to the top systematic reviews, we're doing science that says, let's get rid of all the contextual information and find out the one right answer. And that's not really helpful in a complex problem. An alternate way to think about this might be something like this, the intervention level framework. This is based on the work of Donella Meadows, a well-known systems thinker, but it's really to help you understand that maybe actually at the top of the pyramid, the hardest things to change, but the most effective things for us are actually understanding deeply held beliefs, which doesn't match nicely with the evidence-based medicine pyramid. And then trying to understand our goals, structures, feedback loops, and delays. And the stuff down at the bottom is the stuff where most of the science is done. And I'll just add to this that I think when I was listening to the discussion from the groups, some of the groups are really up at that deeply held belief level. You don't even know the shared deeply held beliefs across the stakeholders that you're interested in. Some of you might be starting to come to a common understanding of what the goals are, but none of you are really thinking about the structure just yet. Actually, maybe that's unfair. There was some talk about governance and the structure as a whole. So you're kind of there, but we need to, I think the need is to shift the mindset even more. And I'll just show you, we did a study a number of years ago where we looked at recommendations, so evidence-based recommendations to address obesity. And this just illustrates that most of those recommendations are down at that bottom level, the least effective stuff, and that you probably need to do the most of if you want to get actual change. But that's where a reductionist approach to the building of evidence takes you, because that's where you can get it. And yet we need to understand people's deeply held beliefs. We need to understand the goals that the system is trying to achieve, not necessarily the ones you're trying to achieve, but the way the system works. There's very little work on system structure or feedback loops. Those are all things that really one needs to pay attention to. So I've made the comment that we need to shift the way we think about it. And here's another framework for you. Just a second. In this framework from Trish Greenhall, who did this work on diffusion of innovation many years ago already. This is from 2004. She points out that that for complex problems, you need a help it happen approach. So diffusing the innovations that you're developing in your research programs really need negotiated influence and enabled approaches, social and technical. But you guys are living in a funding structure that wants to make it happen, that wants these problems to be scientific, orderly, planned, regulated, all of those sorts of things. And here's one piece of evidence was, just looking at the deliverables for the STOP program, I think there's at least 50 here. I didn't count them all up, but this very kind of make it happen and tell us what you're going to do approach without having a learning and an iterative approach is actually not that helpful to you in building a sustainable program. So added key message now is we need to attend to and do research on things like deeply held beliefs, and we need the structures to be more help it happen. I made the comment that problem definition and resolution are concomitant. I used this figure just to illustrate it came from a stakeholder engaged workshop that was done years ago on the obesity system map, where in the UK, they got a bunch of government departments together to have a conversation. Which of the variables in this map are relevant to the work we do? So it was a tool for building common understanding and for building collaboration across different silos in government, which we all have. I don't know how far it actually went, but I just gave it to you to illustrate that idea that you define the problem, and then you want to resolve it. And the problem definition helps you with problem resolution. One of the interesting things about this map is that the food industry was not very deeply involved. And so, so you don't have much problem resolution coming up or collaboration coming up as a result of them not being involved in the production in the first place. We've been talking, many of you said that relationships are key. I found this piece and I thought it was really interesting because it speaks about the notion that strong ties allow us and help us receive useful knowledge. But it's mediated by the competence of the individuals and the benevolence of the trust that's built. I have to think about that a little bit, but it means that strong ties are valuable to us as we build relationships with people who we expect to be competent and support the work we're doing. We get that competence-based trust is really important when the knowledge is tacit. So rather than the knowledge being in a published paper, it's something that somebody knows from their experience. So hopefully you have trust in my competence to make some of these comments here, because some of it is tacit knowledge. And lastly, that's the structural benefit. There's actually is benefit to even weak ties. And that is the access to information that you can get through being part of a collaborative group. And that's actually usually where networks start, is in that sharing place where you get to learn what other people are doing, and you come to that space because you are going to learn something and get something, and over time you build trust and become a community that actually works together. So it led me to actually ask the question when I was thinking about your projects, just what is the relational capacity? How much effort are you able to, or do you expend in just building those relationships that you need to have to do this work in a complex system? And so just to kind of summarize it, I would argue that our approach needs to be more relational than it does transactional. And yet we live in systems that are very transactional. We conduct business instead of build relationships. We use contracts and that are negotiable and debatable instead of developing dependent mutual relationships to others and stuff like that. So I write these as dualities. They're not really dualities. And my suggestion is here, again, that we need to push more into that relational space. So just to summarize, we need to build more relational capacity, become less transactional. And my last set of comments here is that framing matters. And so these two different frames for knowledge translation kind of lead you down a different path for thinking about what to do next, right? One says, well, one might be throw up your hands because you think it's too complex, but it really argues that you need to build all those small relationships from the ground up and help those relationships happen. Whereas the other one feels a little bit more technical. And so the way I like to argue is we need to stop thinking of knowledge translation as passing knowledge on, which is typically how we started doing it at CIHR. It's what that original frame provides us. And it's what I'm hearing through, listening to the work and looking at your websites. That's my sense of the paradigm that you're working with. But really what we need to do is learn. We need to move from that sort of accountability metric that we did our part, we're going to throw it over the fence, to thinking about learning. And learning is about things like challenging experiences, the opportunity to practice. When do our funding schemes give us trial and error opportunities? We need the creative conversations that you were starting to have today and maybe you've had before. And we even need time for reflection. That's actually an important part of our data in trying to tackle these problems. So here is another duality I like to push, which is that we need to shift away from, where we can, accountability structures and move towards learning structures. So rather than emphasizing targets, let's emphasize continuous improvement. Rather than evaluation that's independent, actually self-assessment and participation becomes important, attribution to improvement, etc. So we want a system that actually works and will be much more sustainable if we embed the practices of a systems approach instead of the rules for this project that we want to follow. So more focus on learning and less on accountability. One last comment, and I think this is really relevant to the conversation that you were having. So this is something called the Berkana two-loop model. It's one illustration of it. You can Google Berkana two-loop model and you'll find a great video as well as other variations on the theme. But the upper loop there that's kind of going up and then down is some old paradigm for the way we think about things. And as a paradigm starts to reach its peak, what you see is innovators falling off that paradigm, and they start to create new things. These are people, and especially if you create a network of these people, as I said, they come there for their own purposes initially, but as you support them in building that relational capacity, then what you gradually do is build the strength of that network, and it becomes what they would call a community of practice. And so now you're there not only for yourself, but for the other people who are there, and you become a community that works together. And from that emerges a real system of influence. So real change comes from a strong group of individuals who trust each other and can work well together. And I love this picture as well because it illustrates the idea that as the old paradigm dies, and certainly when we think about fossil fuel industry, you need bridges to transition from one loop to the other. And it doesn't say it here, but that green arrow down is kind of this one here is a composting arrow that suggests you need to also get rid of the old industrial pieces. How that applies to childhood obesity, well, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of the mechanisms by which we're trying to address childhood obesity and trying to shift our thinking to ways that are more sustainable. So do you guys have a sustainable, what is your sustainability plan? Well, I think you're hampered a bit in the structure that you're working with, but if you can take on a few of these ideas about shifting from accountability to learning, about focusing on building a common understanding and building trust, then do as much of that as you can, frankly, if you want to bring more knowledge transfer to the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. That's a really great presentation, very helpful insights. I wish this presentation could be given to the people who are managing the European research funding programs, because I mean, many of the points that you've raised about the structure that we have given to our projects is really very much driven by the requirements of the European Commission,
yeah.
and the way the funder has set up these programs. So
yeah, that is absolutely my point. And I've seen, like I'm on the co-create board, and the structure with the work packages, and it's been duplicated in other systems like the UK PRP. I just think, I think we're going down the wrong path. Now, I have to admit, having been a funder, it is very, very hard to change that paradigm. And I tried when I was in those organizations that I worked in, but even those exercises were kind of one-offs. It was hard to embed real change in the system.
Thank you. I will open this up for questions. You may post your questions in the chat, or you may just open your microphone and speak or raise your hand, perhaps. I will only ask people to keep their questions or comments brief so that we can give more people an opportunity to ask questions. I see some comments in the chat, but I don't see any specific questions.
If I may come in just shortly, thanks really a lot, Franco, for thinking of Diane to join us for this session. We were really searching for somebody who would be able to tell us exactly what she was talking about. And I had the same question because our call was titled like Joint Action on Best Practices in Nutrition. So it's really what Karin is saying in the chat, that we have to do more systems building together with people also from the Commission and us together. And we have been discussing similar concepts during the dialogues in the afternoon, and in one of the groups it came up also from, I think, the younger voices, that we have to think about relations and the quality of relations, not just about the topic itself. So I think it's really important, and a lot of fruit for thought. So you gave us really insights where and in which direction to move to be able to really make a change. And my main learning here is that yes, you said so nicely that this relational capacity need for networks of the member states, and you need a strong group of individuals who believe each other. And I think that we are missing a strong group of the national member states, at least at the EU level. So very well argumented. We will use the argument. So thank you so much. I don't know if I have questions, because you really raised so many of the answers, not questions, to us.
Can I have a question?
I think Albert.
But I see that Caroline has a question in the chat.
Go ahead, Albert, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you. This is Albert from the Best-ReMaP project. It was an excellent presentation. So my question is, you have been discussing about paradigms, right? And do you feel any even slight differences between how the paradigm of modern obesity is discussed in Canada than in Europe, right? Because you see the two ends of the Atlantic. So for us, I think maybe it would be interesting if you could give a bit of insight on that. Thank you.
So interesting question. And I'm not sure that I'm as up to date on current paradigms and deeply held beliefs about obesity in Europe versus Canada right now, because my work has strayed a bit away from obesity since the time that I was doing that. But I would hazard a guess that that they're probably not terribly different in a very high level zoomed out view. But, I think there are local differences in the way what people's deeply held beliefs are. I know, and I think they've only moved a little bit. Like, I think we are moving away from what we were talking about 20 years ago as a deeply held focus on, move more, eat less, and its individual responsibility. I think we understand that it's less about that and more about the context in which we live. But we've spent so much time working out those causes that I don't think we've spent enough time thinking, how do we shift the paradigm? One of the comments I didn't really make, but I'll make here because I think it's relevant, is we've been pretty good in Canada at getting policymakers to say we need the evidence, but we don't have the right kind of evidence to get them to create systems that support you in the relationship building work. So where is the evidence that what I've said works? It all makes a lot of sense. Intuition makes sense, but where's the evidence? And I think there's some out there, but it's pretty dispersed. Systems thinking has the same problem as KT. There's 100 different ways to talk about it in different disciplines. And the work I just did recently with the UK Academy of Medical Sciences and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences kind of spoke to the need for an ability to talk across these areas. And we need that talk across if we're going to ever synthesize the evidence that building trust and building relational capacity is a good investment, right? So I feel like that's hampering us to some extent. It's one of my own, I'll say, hobby horses, if you will. And I don't, that's a paradigm that needs to change. So I've strayed off your question. I apologize, probably because I can't answer it very well and gone on to things that I care more about. So apologies for that. I will just say one time, back 15 years ago, I was asked by the chair of the Standing Committee on Health, who was doing a study on childhood obesity. So this is like in 2005 in Canada. What should be the targets for childhood obesity? Should we reduce it by 5% or whatever? And I refused to answer his question. I said, it doesn't give you any benefit. It doesn't help you to have a target, because if you only measure the target and you achieve it, you don't know why you achieved it. And if you don't reach the target, then you don't know why you didn't achieve it. So move upstream and measure processes. And again, I bet Europe and Canada are no different in this. And yes, the EU 2020 program or those programs are deeply top-down, make it happen programs from what I've seen. So yeah, if they want to talk to me, I'm happy to talk to them. Sorry, Albert, I wish I'd given you a better answer to your question.
Thank you, Diane. There are a couple of questions in the chat. The participants asking for your insights about how we can change paradigms and those deeply held beliefs that you've mentioned earlier. And Carolyn is especially highlighting the paradigm clash that there is typically between health and finance ministries. And it would be really helpful if you had a specific experience of in which you've been successful in changing paradigms.
So I will speak on the Caroline's question. I kind of alluded to the answer to that mostly people like finance ministers and investors don't see the evidence. And we don't have the evidence to show them that these kinds of approaches are actually better. But intuitively, lots of us get it and it makes sense. There is a little bit of progress. I've been consulting with a fellow who does have deep roots with the federal government in Canada, and he knows people in Treasury Board, and he's been talking to them. He also gets this, and the way he's been remotely successful is to take a kind of standard evaluation framework that's really mostly about accountability and push the idea that you need to include reach in accountability for these kinds of programs. So he's coming from the make it happen side. He's working with people who are on that side, and he's pushing them into this recognition that stakeholder engagement is important by talking about and using reach as his approach. So that's one sort of, I think, he's getting some success with that. Trying to do it from the inside. I like to just beat people over the head that they're doing it wrong. So, that's not necessarily very successful. In terms of, I'm just looking at the other questions, the changes of paradigm can create conflicts between old and new. Yep, absolutely. Do I have experience in overcoming such conflicts? Yes, I don't know if I have a good enough story to tell that really is so successful. I mean, in the funding paradigm model, that's probably where I've tried to create a shift from old to new paradigms. When I was at our federal funder, and it was the early days of the organization, so you could kind of do stuff without people paying attention. I created a program called Canada on the Move through my role as a scientific director in an institute that was focused on obesity. And this was built out of a collaboration with Kellogg's Canada, the cereal makers, who were putting pedometers in boxes of cereal. And we built a relationship with them that said, that actually had our logo on the back of the box, and it said, walk, log on, and donate your steps to health research. So the whole collaboration started there at a place that was hugely beneficial to them, probably beneficial to us. And within 3 months of the agreement that we would do that, we then had to get a group of researchers together behind the scenes to actually build the website that would receive the steps, receive the information, and also a group of researchers doing projects that ended up being in a supplement to the Canadian Journal of Public Health. So there's a whole set of research papers that was around that project, but it required an organizational structure to shift, to bring people together in a different way. When the researchers came together, they were trying to tell me what to do. And I said, no, you figure out what you need to do, and we'll find a way to provide some funding. And just the side story on that's quite fascinating, because I know you guys are talking about collaboration with the food industry, is after all was said and done, and we showed the galley proofs of the whole supplement for the Canadian Journal on Public Health to our food industry partners, they complained about one line in one paper. The paper talked about how bad their pedometers were. And the one line they complained about was the speculation in the discussion that this might lead to behavior change. So we navigated that by getting the researcher, having them talk to the researcher, and the researcher didn't feel it was important enough, so took the line out. So yes, you have to just you have to believe in what you're trying to accomplish, and then work at building those relationships.
Thank you, Diane. Are there any final quick questions from the audience? Maybe we can conclude on the point raised by Dorota.
Yeah. good question. I think in some places it's helped and in some places it hasn't. And so when I think about my own experience here in Canada around truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous people, which is something that has really risen out of and been part of the pandemic story, or about anti-Black racism in the US and many other places, I think we've pushed mental models to change in certain areas, but we've also pushed mental models to retreat into certain, black and white situations, polarized ways. So which forces will win out? Those that are shifting towards a more collaborative, empathetic approach versus those that are more polarized? I'm not gonna, that is something you couldn't predict. So it's too complex.
Thank you very much, Diane. So we are spot on time. Maybe just one final thought from you, Diane. When you talked about the sort of hierarchy of factors or elements that set us apart or set stakeholders apart, starting from paradigms and then goals and systems and so on. You didn't mention interests, which is often a key factor that really, sets different stakeholders apart and makes it difficult to, have a dialogue and reach a shared conclusion. What is the place for interests in your framework?
So one way to think about that would be, I'll just reflect back on some work I did when I was still working in the obesity area more deeply, where I had a stakeholder engagement workshop with, we had the food industry, academics, government, NGOs, and health practitioners in this workshop. And we started by having them sit at stakeholder specific tables and ask them to identify what the top of the pyramid looked like for them. What were their deeply held beliefs about obesity or childhood obesity? And what were the goals of the system that they're part of, be it the food industry or others? And just ask them to come to grips. And one of the things I learned from that is that within sector agreement about this stuff is actually sometimes harder than between sector agreement and engagement. But what came out of that, when they spoke their truth back to the room, you could see eyebrows raised, you could see surprise, because nobody in the food industry wants their child to become obese. That's, but we don't stop to think about that. And we don't consider that they also might have some of the same goals or interests and some that are different. So using that framework to have a dialogue across sectors is a good place to start building what I would call a safe space, because some other work I did around building trust with to address obesity really came out with that notion that people need a safe space so that they can speak their interests and then figure out how to come together to build solutions. So, the guy from Campbell's Soup told me about their experience with reducing sodium in their product and then having to, and they were ahead of the game. You start to learn things about what happens in industry, for example, that you don't necessarily understand from your own perspective. So building a common understanding of different sectors' interests is actually super important.
Thank you so much, Diane. What you said is just gold for the group of us working on stakeholder engagement in the STOP project and also in Best-ReMaP. So your insights would be very valuable going forward in our projects. I'm sure everyone ideally is joining me in thanking you for this great presentation and your answers to our questions. We really hope there will be an opportunity to meet you in person sometime soon, when the next time you may be in Europe, perhaps. So thank you very much again.